Welcome inside the Dynasty War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 5 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to break down the results of the NFL Combine, which took place this past week in Indianapolis, and discuss some winners and losers from the event. If you missed out on any of the show's previous episodes, you can find them on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or just about any other platform where you typically listen to podcasts. Make sure you follow the show on the platform of your choice, subscribe to Dynasty War Room on YouTube, and follow the show on Twitter at Dynasty War Room. This episode should be one of the most helpful to you as you prepare for your Dynasty rookie drafts later this spring. The NFL Combine is an extremely important event for evaluating incoming rookies, and this is our opportunity to compare data all taken from the same event. I have compiled the results of every Combine event and identified which players met certain thresholds that are critical to hit, and have even identified a couple potential sleepers to target at the end of your rookie drafts. Now, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today is going to be expanding on research done by Mason Dodd of Fantasy Flock, who compiled data on the top 12 players at each position in every year over the last 15 years to see how well elite fantasy assets performed at the Combine. We've taken those benchmarks and applied them to this year's results to give us some winners and losers to discuss. So we'll just jump right into it. We will start with wide receivers. A lot of the data today that we're going to talk about is primarily going to be focused on wide receivers and running backs. There wasn't a whole lot in terms of quarterbacks, especially that would be draftable in a superflex draft to discuss, but we will get to quarterback at the end. Same with tight end, not quite as much. Unfortunately, Brock Bowers did not do full testing, but we do have some things to discuss there and a couple of sleepers at the tight end position. But running back, wide receiver, that's primarily what we're going to talk about today. So starting at wide receiver, the two biggest names, Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Nabers, they did not participate at the Combine. Malik Nabers did not even weigh in or do a height, anything like that. I suspect that's because he's going to end up being a little bit smaller than we thought. I don't know that he's actually going to be 6 feet. So that's something to look out for at the LSU Pro Day before the draft. But Marvin Harrison at least weighed in. But it was Rome Odunze that was sort of the biggest name that actually participated at the Combine in all the drills. So we'll start with the winners of the wide receiver class at the Combine. And we'll just kick it off with Rome Odunze because Rome Odunze was awesome. He participated in every event besides the bench press, which we won't really talk about much today at all because it really doesn't matter with fantasy football in terms of predictability or anything like that. It'll be all of the other metrics that we take a look at. But Rome Odunze, he came in at 6'3", 212 pounds, and he met the thresholds that we want in everything across the board. And not just did he meet the thresholds, because frankly, pretty much everyone across the board met the bare minimum thresholds that we're going to look for, and we'll go through event by event. But Rome Odunze was 50th percentile or better in 40-yard dash, 10-yard split, vertical jump, broad jump, 3-cone, and shuttle, along with relative athletic score, the RAS, which is something that is increasingly helpful in identifying rookie prospects in terms of how it takes into account their height and their weight and their speed and agility, everything all into one nice score out of 10. So we'll touch on that a bit in a minute. But Rome Odunze was great across the board, and we'll start first by explaining a little bit about what these minimum thresholds are that we're going to be looking at. So in terms of the 40-yard dash, that's the big event that everyone looks forward to at the Combine. Not the most important, especially at the wide receiver position, but it is an important metric still. So with the 40-yard dash, we are looking for prospects that are at a bare minimum 4.70 or better. If you're below a 4.7, probably going to be pretty much useless for fantasy football. Frankly, 4.6, if you're under 200 pounds, also pretty much useless. So in terms of this research that was done by Fantasy Flock, so we'll look at the 25th percentile, 50th percentile, and 75th percentile outcome for top 12 wide receivers in each of the past 15 seasons. So that gives us, at the 25th percentile mark, a 4.56, at the 50th percentile, 4.49, and the 75th percentile of wide receiver ones, 4.42. So if you're in that range or better, you're in great shape in terms of 40-yard dash, in terms of its predictability moving forward. So Rome Odunze ran a 4.45, which is above that 50th percentile mark. So we love that, especially given his size at 6'3", 212 pounds. And we're going to go through, we'll get to the other players and what they ran in these positions, but I want to just kind of go through each of these events and use Rome Odunze as the example so we can understand what we're talking about before we get in too deep here. But 10-yard split is up next. You want a bare minimum of a 1.65 in that 10-yard split. If you're below that, you're probably way too slow to be a difference maker at the NFL level at wide receiver. And really, you want to be better than a 1.62. The 25, 50, and 75 percentile marks here are 1.6, 1.57, and 1.53. Now, Rome Odunze came in at 1.52, so better than 75th percentile speed in that first 10 yards, which is something really nice to have. I think those 10 and 20-yard splits can sometimes be more important than the 40-yard dash, because how often are you seeing a receiver actually run 40 yards in a straight line? So 10-yard split is a nice metric, shows some burst at the beginning of those routes. Next category is vertical jump, bare minimum of a 30, but we're really looking at least 33, and the 25, 50, and 75 number marks here: 34.5, 36.5, and 38.5. Obviously, the higher that vertical, the better. You want receivers that can high point the ball, come down with those tough catches, reduces the chances of them being overthrown. Rome Odunze came in at 39, so again, beat that 75th percentile mark. Next to the broad jump, we want a bare minimum of 9 feet. And frankly, we really want above 9 feet, 10 inches. So the 25, 50, and 75 marks here are 10 feet, 10 foot 3 inches, and 10 foot 7 inches. Rome Odunze came in at 10.4, which again is better than 50%. So great numbers across the board. Rome Odunze, in fact, is the only wide receiver that was above the 50th percentile mark in every single category across the board. There were a lot of receivers that met 50th percentile or better in multiple categories or in all the categories that they actually tested, but there were a lot of receivers that did not run the 3-cone drill or the shuttle, which we'll talk about next. And so that limited what players actually met these thresholds all the way across the board. So next is a 3-cone drill. You want a minimum of a 7.3. The 25, 50, and 75th percentile marks here are 7.03, 6.91, and 6.75. So Rome Odunze came in at 6.88, which is again above that 50th percentile mark. So great number there. And last but not least, in terms of an actual drill, is the shuttle. So we're looking for a bare minimum of a 4.5 seconds. And really, we want better than 4.4. But the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile marks are 4.32, 4.25, and 4.1. Rome Odunze came in at 4.03, which is awesome and was the best time of the wide receivers that we're going to talk about in terms of fantasy relevance at the combine. So great numbers there. And then relative athletic score is the last sort of big picture thing I want to talk about here. And the relative athletic score, does a really good job of capturing how, just purely athletic a player is when you take everything else into account. So height, weight, it takes in, as I mentioned a minute ago, 40-yard dash, the shuttle, and 3-cone. It's supposed to encompass speed and agility and just take height and weight into account. So it's really a great scoring system here that we have. And Rome Odunze had a 9.91, which is awesome. That's almost a perfect score, obviously. It was the second highest among the receivers on my list to talk about today, behind only Brian Thomas Jr. who came in with a 9.97. But with this relative athletic score, you really are going to ignore anybody that is under a 4 and really under 5 as well. There are some instances of hits in that 4 to 5 range, but they're very limited. The 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile marks for the RAS are 6.81, 8.18, and 9.45. So you're really looking for someone that can, be above that 8. Above the 6 is kind of a good, minimum number here. But, the higher the better. You always want more athletic receivers. So Rome Odunze, again, is the only one that was just plus all the way across the board. Really had a great combine. Had a chance to stick out as a number 1 receiver at the event with Marvin Harrison and Malik Nabers not participating. And I think this really solidifies Rome Odunze as not only a top 10 NFL draft pick, but potentially a top 7 pick and the far and away the clear number 3 receiver in this draft class. I think there's going to be a lot of people that, think about bumping him to 2 ahead of Malik Nabers. I'm not going to be there unless, Malik Nabers comes in and he's only like 5'9" or something ridiculous. But, if we assume that Malik Nabers maybe checks in at, 5'11", 195, something like that, which I think is pretty likely, I'm still going to have Malik Nabers above Rome Odunze. But I love Odunze now. I think there's a good chance I might have him ahead of some of the other quarterbacks in this draft. I think the general consensus for a long time had been, it's going to be Caleb Williams, Marvin Harrison, and then 2 quarterbacks. I'm not so sure about that anymore. Rome Odunze is going to be finding his way a little bit higher up the board for me. And, we'll talk about quarterbacks later, but, there's a real mess, I think, between that QB 2, 3, and 4. I'm not really sure what order to put those guys in right now. So Rome Odunze is going to be our first winner of the NFL Combine. Next, I'm going to go to the guy that I currently have as a wide receiver 4 in my rookie rankings, but he had a great combine, and that's Brian Thomas Jr. We mentioned him a minute ago as having a 9.97 relative athletic score, which is incredible, but he also was awesome across the board in all the events that he did. He did not run the 3-cone or the shuttle, unfortunately, but outside of coming in at 6'3" instead of 6'4", there were a lot of receivers, a lot of players across the board, but receivers in particular where the schools listed their height being, better than it actually was, and some of the weights, as we'll get to in a second, were a little bit off. But Brian Thomas Jr. came in at 6'3", 209 pounds, and weight also matters at the wide receiver position. It matters more at running back, but in terms of weight, you really want your receivers to be at least 180 pounds. There has never been a wide receiver 1 over the last 15 years that has weighed less than 180 pounds. So, again, that might change in the future because we've seen some lighter receivers come into the league and have success. Tank Dell, extremely small. If it wasn't for his injury, he'd be making a case. He has a chance to be one next year. Devontae Smith is a smaller guy. Jordan Addison, smaller guy. But that could be shifting in the future. But it is still important to note that up until now, we have not had a wide receiver 1 under 180 pounds in the last 15 years. Those 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile marks for weight are 195, 209, and 214. So you're really looking for a receiver that is, somewhere in that, 200-pound range, and Brian Thomas fits the bill, just like Rome Odunze. Marvin Harrison also weighed in at 209, so that's, something great to see. He came in at 6'3" in the height category, but Brian Thomas Jr. ran a 4.33 40-yard dash, which was awesome. And, we're going to get to Xavier Worthy in a minute, who broke the combine record of the 4.21. But at 6'3", 209 pounds, this 4.33 almost matters more for Brian Thomas than it does for a guy like Xavier Worthy, who is significantly smaller. Thomas Jr. has, the height-speed combo that I think a lot of people really desire in both the NFL and in fantasy football. So he's an elite deep threat. He had great numbers across the board. He had a 1.5 10-yard split, which was even better than Rome Odunze. That, again, is better than the 75th percentile mark. He had a 38.5-foot vertical, which very close to Rome Odunze, who had a 39. So, great mark there. That is the 75th percentile mark for wide receiver ones in the past 15 years. He had a 10.6 broad jump, which very close to the 75th percentile mark. And we mentioned that 9.97 RAS. So, got a little bit more speed than Odunze. Don't think he certainly doesn't have the breadth of production, but again, red zone threat, a deep threat, somebody that I think is very much going to be a lock to be a first round pick, and has probably solidified himself, at least in my eyes, as the wide receiver 4 in my rookie rankings. Now, our next winners of the combine at the wide receiver position, I'm going to go with A.D. Mitchell out of Texas. He came in at 6'2", 205, and he ran a really nice 40-yard dash, 4.34, which is great for his size. He had the 1.52 in the 10-yard split, which is, again, better than that 75th percentile mark. He 39.5 foot vertical and an 11.4 broad jump. So one thing that's important to note with the vertical and the broad jump is that while it maybe doesn't directly translate, especially the broad jump, to playing football, these metrics in general and these drills are often used to see how explosive a player is. So that's why these events, still get, a lot of weight coming out of the combine. It's not, this player can jump high or jump far. These metrics are supposed to show how explosive a player is, in addition to, how high you can, reach a jump ball, that kind of thing at the receiver position. So these marks also show that a player is very explosive, is the whole point to this message. So 39.5 for A.D. Mitchell, and then an 11.4 broad jump is a great number. That is the best out of the receivers here on my list that we're going to talk about. So we like to see that. He came in. Oh, and I misspoke. A.D. Mitchell had a 9.98 relative athletic score. So I misspoke earlier about Rome Odunze having the second highest and Brian Thomas having the highest score. They are both behind A.D. Mitchell, who came in with a 9.98. So great score there. Uber athletic. The one knock with A.D. Mitchell, I don't think he had the best in terms of running routes and the pass catching. In terms of the actual drills at the combine, they were not as good as his testing. So when I say he's a winner, I'm speaking a little bit more just as the measurements and the testing, because I still don't. I'm still not a believer in A.D. Mitchell. He's going to be lower on my draft board than he is others, but he is somebody that I at least wanted to highlight because he did have a great testing portion of the combine, and I think that's what a lot of people like to pay attention to coming out of this week. So A.D. Mitchell out of Texas is the next winner on my list, number 3. So the next winner, though, and we have more winners than losers, which I suppose is always good coming out of the combine, but Ladd McConkey out of Georgia, 6 foot, 186, so a little undersized, but he had some great testing numbers. 4.39 in the 40-yard dash, well above the 75th percentile mark. 1.52 in the 10-yard split. Only a 36 in the vertical jump, but still within those 20, right around that 50th percentile mark that we want to see, and a 10.4 in the broad jump. He ended up with an 8.88 relative athletic score, above the 50th percentile mark. And Ladd McConkey is somebody that I was nowhere near high enough coming into the draft process. He wasn't even on my top 24 rookie rankings simply because he lacked the production that I like to see out of receivers. And that still remains, an issue for me. I still think I'm going to be a little bit lower on him compared to others, but he is creeping up my ranks. He's probably a borderline first, second round pick. I think early second probably makes a lot of sense for Ladd McConkey. And he's just a pure separator. He's a route runner. He gets open. He's got really nice speed. And there's always a place for that in the NFL. he's somebody that I worry maybe isn't as impactful for your fantasy team as he will be for his NFL team, but still somebody that had a really nice combine, and I want to point that out, especially since I have not been as high on him in the past. Another guy that I have not been as high on in the past, but was a winner of the combine, Ricky Pearsall from Florida. I actually completely omitted him from last week's episode, where he was selected in that 4-round rookie mock draft we did, but I just missed his name on the list. So apologies to all the Ricky Pearsall fans out there, but he had a great combine, and he's actually had a really good pre-draft process. He's getting a lot of buzz on social media right now. 6'1", 189 pounds out of Florida. He ran a 4.41 in the 40-yard dash. He had a 1.57 in the 10-yard split. He had a 42-foot vertical, which is just incredible. No, it is inch. And I'm pretty sure I've been messing that up throughout this entire podcast, so apologies about that. It is the vertical is in inches. That would be completely insane if somebody could jump 42 feet in the air. So Rome Odunze, 39 inches. Brian Thomas, 38.5. A.D. Mitchell, 38. And Ladd McConkey, 36. So Ricky Pearsall had really great marks across the board. He was one of the only other receivers to complete all of the drills. So the only reason he does not have that like perfect combine score in my eyes as like Rome Odunze did was because Rome Odunze was within the 25th, 75th percentile for weight, but Ricky Pearsall at 189 did not meet that number. But in terms of all the drills at the combine, he was awesome. 10.9 in the broad jump, 6.64 3-cone drill, which was the fastest of the receivers that I'm going to talk about today, and a 4.05 shuttle time. So really good agility and quickness. And for somebody that didn't have a ton of production in college, having speed and agility numbers like this is really a great sign. He had a 9.65 relative athletic score. So Ricky Pearsall, another winner from the NFL Combine. Now I got two more at the wide receiver position before we move on. But one is Xavier Legette out of South Carolina, 6'1", 221 pounds. And he met all of the numbers, including weight, for the events that he did at the Combine, but he did not do a 3-cone drill or a shuttle. So, would have been nice to see that. But given his size at 221 pounds, running a 4.39 in the 40-yard dash was incredible. And he had a 1.54 10-yard split, 40-inch vertical, and a 10.6 broad jump. So good explosive numbers there. Somebody that I think is really kind of a freak athlete and had a great 5th year in college at South Carolina. But again, we've talked about this in the past, but he was completely invisible for the first 4 years of his college career. And so I am very worried about drafting someone like that in my rookie draft. So he'll probably go higher than I'm willing to take him. But I will give him some credit for a great combine that will certainly end up making him some money in the NFL draft. And last but not least is Johnny Wilson, wide receiver from Florida State, kind of known as the other wide receiver from Florida State. But he was great at the Combine. He's 6'6", 231 pounds. I think he would do really, really well if moved to tight end in the NFL. But ran a 4.52, which at 6'6", 231 is a great number. 1.55 10-yard split, which is right in line with a lot of these other receivers. 37 in the vertical, 10.8 in the broad jump. And he did run a shuttle at 4.11, which is really elite agility, especially for someone of his size. So we like to see that. And he had a 9.88 RAS. So very athletic. Somebody that certainly should have a role somewhere in the NFL. He's probably going to be a mid-round pick somewhere. But whether it is as a bigger outside receiver or as a tight end, he's somebody that could be kind of a late round steal in that 3rd or 4th round of your rookie draft. given how athletic he is. So there are the winners of the combine at the wide receiver position. I'll touch on them again here. We got Rome Odunze, Brian Thomas Jr., A.D. Mitchell, Ladd McConkey, Ricky Pearsall, Xavier Legette, and Johnny Wilson. Now I'm going to get into the losers. So there are not going to be as many, and there won't be as many losers across the board in any of the positions as there were winners, which I think is good to see. This is probably the best wide receiver class we've had in a while. It's certainly the most athletic and the fastest. I believe I saw something on Twitter that indicated that this was the fastest wide receiver class ever at the combine. So a lot of depth here at the position, but there were a couple guys that had their draft stock fall a little bit in my eyes. And number one was Troy Franklin, wide receiver out of Oregon. He came in shorter than expected at just under 6'2". It was about 10 pounds less than what he weighed in at Oregon, 176. So, that's unfortunate. We hate to see when schools, hurt their players by listing them at something, that's vastly different than their actual height and weight. And the big thing that stuck about Franklin was, he was supposed to be a 6'3", 187 pound receiver that had the size and the speed. And here, he still has size and speed, but the size is not as good as we would have liked to see. So that hurts a bit. He did run a 4.41 in the 40-yard dash, which is solid. However, his 10-yard split was a 1.61, which is below the 25th percentile mark from the research of those top 12 wide receivers every year the last 15 years. Now, it's above the minimum thresholds. It's, above the 1.65 and above the 1.62, which are the, sort of two lower thresholds that we're looking at. So he didn't fall all the way out. But for somebody that had a 4.41, I am a little surprised that that number was that high. Would have been nice if it was somewhere in the 1.5s, but it was not. So that, that does hurt a little bit. But he did have some solid, vertical and broad jump numbers, 39 in the vertical, 10.4 in the broad jump. He had a 6.9 three-cone drill, which is right around, right at that 50th percentile mark of the past 15 years for wide receiver ones. So good numbers there. Okay shuttle, 4.31, and he checked in with a 9.33 relative athletic score. So certainly not bad. I think it was just one of those things where I came into it sort of expecting so much from Troy Franklin, and then I didn't quite get as much as I wanted. So he was somebody that was in contention for my wide receiver 4 spot. I don't know that I'm going to have him there. I probably won't have him at wide receiver 5 anymore either. He'll still certainly be in consideration, but he's probably somewhere in that 5, 6, 7 range now. Maybe even 8. We'll have to see as we get more into, film this month. That's what March will be dedicated to. But Troy Franklin, the first loser of the combine. Now, the next loser is sort of a soft loser because I don't want to. One thing that's really important when analyzing the NFL Combine, you don't want to penalize players twice. So if you go into something knowing that a player is fast or slow or whatever it is, you don't want to then punish them a second time after you've already taken them down in your rankings once because of that fact. So one great example, the other way is with the 40-yard dash times with Xavier Worthy. So Xavier Worthy, in a lot of ways, is a winner, and he's not the player I'm going to focus on here. So certainly not a loser of the combine. But Xavier Worthy went out and ran a 4.21, had incredible speed numbers, great vertical and broad jump numbers too. Really, really explosive guy. 9.37 in the relative athletic score. But I don't want to bump Xavier Worthy too far up my rankings because I already had him fairly high because I knew he was a speedster. So it would have been something where if Xavier Worthy had come out and run a 4.6, that would have really hurt him. But I'm not going to artificially inflate his draft position just because he ran a great 40 time. Now, it was better than expected. I think I was looking for something more around 4.3, but 4.21, awesome. But Xavier Worthy in his own right checked in at 5'11", 165. So we just talked about Troy Franklin with, a sub 180-pound weight at 176, where we have never had a wide receiver 1 come in at below 180 pounds. So that is something to be concerned about for both Troy Franklin and Xavier Worthy. But I can't count Xavier Worthy as a loser after his incredible 40-yard time and his other explosive numbers. He's actually much closer to a winner of the draft, or a winner of the combine, but I am still very worried about the weight. So that was a little bit of a tangent here. But I noticed that here in my spreadsheet, and it was something I wanted to touch on since we didn't get into Xavier Worthy. But he was sort of the story of the combine. But the player I actually was going to talk about here as sort of the soft loser is Keon Coleman, wide receiver out of Florida State, 6'3", 213 pounds. So good size, good weight, but he ran a 4.61, which is slower than you would like to see. Your 40-yard time does not matter a ton in terms of how predictive it is as a stat for wide receivers in fantasy, but there are certain minimum thresholds, like we've talked about a little bit already on this episode, and 4.7 is kind of your bare minimum at receiver that you want to be above, or if you're sub 200 pounds, you want to be at least at 4.60. So Keon Coleman was not below a 4.7. He did not fall out entirely here. So certainly does not eliminate him from ever being a wide receiver 1. But I just wanted to point that out. A little bit concerning. His 20-yard split at 2.68 was, barely above the minimum threshold of a 2.7. But at the same time, he had a 9.12 at relative athletic score, and he's a bigger dude. So, while he is a little slow, he got through the gauntlet drill, which is, the big receiving drill that they run at the combine where they throw passes at you as you run in a straight line. And that was an event where Puka Nacua did very well at last year. So Keon Coleman was very good at that event. So I think while I call it a soft loser because of how slow he was, I think what it really says is that he is who we thought he was, not a separator. He's not going to just blow by you at the line of scrimmage or anything like that. But he's going to catch everything thrown to him. He's got, great jump ball ability, good hands, and that sort of thing. So probably is going to be a great red zone threat in the NFL. But he's just not going to be that smooth, separator that you would really like to see. And he's probably not going to be a first-round pick because of this time. So in that sense, that is really what makes him a loser here coming out of the combine. But, should be still a nice early second-round pick. And it's probably going to go early second in your rookie draft. He has a big name, though, so he is somebody that, could go late first in your, your home leagues. But I don't know that I would be touching him until, you're probably talking 112, 201, 202, something like that, maybe at the earliest. But I could see him falling a little bit more as I really get into my ranks. And that is because of guys like Ladd McConkey and A.D. Mitchell that we talked about that really had great combines. So next up is sort of an unfamiliar name to a lot of people, but he had a really bad combine, and that's Jamari Thrash, a wide receiver out of Louisville. Somebody that I had seen projected, fourth round a lot of the times, but, potential third round pick, somebody that, a deep threat, and just had some numbers that, kind of came out as, numbers that you really just don't want to see. And 4.46 40 was good, 1.54 10-yard split, great. So he does have some speed, but his vertical was at 34, and that's below the 25th percentile. Broad jump was at 10, which is right at the 25th percentile. His 3-cone drill, 7.16, which is below the 25th percentile. He has a relative athletic score of only 6.29, which is also below the 25th percentile. So just somebody kind of across the board that, while not a completely terrible combine, it's just something where I don't see the path. I'd seen a lot about him as potential sleeper and somebody that was, could sneak into the third round, something like that. I'm probably not touching him in a rookie draft until the fourth round. And I don't see the path to him being an elite fantasy option at any point in his career. So before we move over here to running backs, I just want to some general comments about the receivers at the combine. we talked about all the speed. So a lot of guys just that showed that they were great athletes. Tez Walker with a 9.88 relative athletic score, ran a 4.36 and had some great jump numbers, a 40.5 in the vertical, 11.2 in the broad. So while I don't love him on tape and his stats are a bit underwhelming, you can see why he's thought of as a pretty good prospect because of how athletic he is. Roman Wilson ran a 4.39 out of Michigan. Came in at 5'11 instead of 6 foot, so lost an inch there, but somebody that I think is just continuing to move up the draft boards. But he did not do a lot of other testing outside of the 40-yard dash. And, just kind of across the board, there's just a lot of depth, a lot of guys that you're going to be able to get in your third and fourth round of the rookie drafts that have some potential and could be, third round picks in the NFL draft. Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, both out of Washington, solid performances at the combine. Nothing special, but certainly nothing bad. Jalen McMillan actually maybe a little bit better of a combine. He ran a 4.47 in the 40, had a good shuttle time. And Malik Washington, a receiver out of Virginia, small slot receiver, he only at 5'8.5", but he 4.47 in the 40, 42.5 in the vertical, which is crazy for somebody of his stature. So we like to see that. He'll probably be somebody that goes in the mid rounds, but a lot of talent across the board, and you're not going to be lacking speed, that's for sure. There's just a lot of really, really great numbers here in the 40-yard dash at the receiver position. So if you're somebody that has kind of stockpiled a lot of late round picks, third and fourth round picks, it's a pretty good year to have that. Whereas most of the time those are really not worth a lot. But here in this draft class, there's a lot of guys that you're going to be able to take a shot on and hope that they pan out. So now we'll move on over to running backs, where it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of who had a great combine and who did not. And running back is typically a position where the combine does matter a little bit more. So, we'll see there's one guy in particular whose draft stock is going to completely fall after his, poor showing in the combines, which is unfortunate because it's somebody that I liked and was in my top 24 rankings. But that's just the way it goes, and that's why the combine is important, so you can get a feel for, who those guys are, and, you can kind of get a feel for where guys will be drafted based on some of these numbers. So we'll start with some winners from the draft. But before I do, I want to go through some of these same thresholds that we did for wide receiver. So again, Mason Dodd from Fantasy Flock researched the running back ones. That's the top 12 running backs in each of the past 15 seasons to see what the thresholds are for, how those players performed at the NFL Combine. So starting with weight, which weight is extremely important at the running back position. So there has only been two running backs, Devon Achane and Devin Sproles are the only two guys under 190 pounds to be wide receiver ones in fantasy football over the last 15 years. So weight does matter. And that number is a little bit lower in the past, or compared to kind of the number we look for traditionally, which always used to be, 200 was the cutoff. But, Jahmyr Gibbs, and there's been a trend here with the running backs that a little bit lighter is okay, kind of the same way that we have seen that with wide receiver. But still, good general rule of thumb, you're looking at, in terms of 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile for running back ones in fantasy, 204 pounds, 215 pounds, and 226 pounds. So if you can find somebody in that 210 to 215 type of range, that's really where you would like to be as a prospect. So moving on now to the 40-yard dash, minimum of a 4.7. There's, you really have to be above a 4.7 in the 40-yard dash in order to be a relevant fantasy asset. And if you run a 4.6 or worse, if you are sub 200 pounds, there's only 4 guys that have ever done that. They each were running back one only one time. So in terms of 25, 50, and 75th percentile marks, we're looking at 4.58, 4.50, and 4.43 in the 40-yard dash. So those are the numbers to keep in mind there. In the 10-yard split, you're looking at a bare minimum threshold of a 1.65, and then that 25, 50, and 75th percentile marks, we're looking at a 1.61, 1.57, and 1.52. In the vertical jump, you're looking at a minimum of about 29 to 30. 29 is sort of the bare minimum, but 30 is still, a handful of examples of guys with the 30 in the vertical, but that end up as running back ones. But you're typically looking at 31.5, 34.5, and 37 as your 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles. But vertical jump is not a super predictive stat at the running back position. It's far more important for wide receivers. The broad jump, looking at a bare minimum of a 9, and the 25, 50, and 75 marks are 9.8, 9.11, and 10.7. 3-cone drill. This is an extremely predictive drill for running backs. Highly important. It's probably the most important of all the drills, which is really unfortunate that only a couple guys actually ran the drill that are fantasy relevant. So of my list here, we've only got 5 guys that participated from my list of about 21 players. So that's 22 players, excuse me. So, you hate to see that, but a couple players, 3 in particular, were awesome. So we're going to talk about them in a minute. But first, in terms of what your thresholds are for the shuttle, you're looking at a bare minimum of a 7.3. Now, the average is 7.15, and I think that's kind of what you should be using as a bare minimum baseline, because the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile marks in the 3-cone drill at running back are 7.09, 6.84, and 6.82. So this number has, really correlated well. The running backs that are above average in the 3-cone, much better chance of hitting as a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. And then next up, we have the shuttle. You're looking at a minimum of a 4.6, but the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile marks, you're looking at a 4.38, 4.24, and 4.20. And then the relative athletic score, the RAS, your bare minimum is a 4, but another threshold you could use is a 5. There's, a few instances, again, players in that mark that have been successful, but you really want players that fall into this 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles, which are 6.05, 8.45, and 9.27. Now, there's one more stat here. Well, it's not really a stat. It's more of a metric that I'm including in my spreadsheet here that I think is very, very important for running backs. And this one is actually from JJ Zacharyson of the Late Round QB podcast, Late Round Podcast, excuse me. He does a great job with his prospect guide, which is coming out soon. You can pre-order it. I already have. And he has a stat that he uses in his running back model called speed score, which is sort of a weight-adjusted speed metric. So you take the 40-yard dash time and you compare that to their height and weight to see kind of what they should be doing. And his minimum threshold for his model as a hit is a 90. And there are a couple names here that did not meet that threshold that are, bigger names. So we're going to touch on a couple of those guys here when we get to the losers. But something important to note, so stick around for that, because unfortunately 2 of those names, pretty big names in the Dynasty community that are not, they're just not likely to make it as running back 1s in fantasy football. So we'll start with the winners. We got a few, and to me, I think there's a very clear top 5 in terms of fantasy running backs right now, and or top 6, I should say, because unfortunately the 6th guy we don't really have much in the way of testing on. So that's Braylon Allen. He's kind of that 6th guy. He didn't do much at the combine, didn't run a 40, so I don't have a ton on him right now. But in terms of everyone else, so it's Braylon Allen plus 5 others who 4 of whom had really awesome combines. And the first winner is going to be Trey Benson. So Trey Benson was already number 2 in my rankings at running back. He's going to have a case at number 1. And just because I did say it, I wanted my top running backs right now based on post-combine results in no order. Trey Benson, Jonathan Brooks, Jalen Wright, Blake Corum, Marshawn Lloyd, and then Braylon Allen. So Trey Benson is the first winner, though, out of Florida State. Came in at 6 foot, 216 pounds, good size, and he ran a 4.39 in the 40-yard dash, which was a great time. 1.52 in the 40-yard split, 33.5 vertical, and 10.2 in the broad jump. So good numbers there across the board, and a 9.77 relative athletic score and a speed score of 116, which was the second highest of the running backs here from the combine. So we love to see that, and he's somebody that, with Jonathan Brooks being unable to participate still due to injury, he's having his chance here to stake his claim as the RB1 in the class. And even though his production was a little bit underwhelming at Florida State, I do think that he's going to be someone that goes on day 2 and will therefore be somebody that probably goes in the early part of your second round rookie drafts, post NFL draft. Jonathan Brooks did not participate, like I just said, but he did weigh in at 216 pounds, which was a good sign, but it's hard to really take a lot of stock in that number because, he can't run. So, we'll see if he's able to do anything at a Texas Pro Day or anything else later on, but can't read too much into his size coming out of the combine. My next winner from the combine is Jalen Wright, running back out of Tennessee, 5'10" and a half, 210 pounds, and this guy is super explosive. Ran a 4.38 in the 40-yard dash, 1.55 in the 10-yard split. Both of those, great numbers, the 40 time in particular. He had a 38-inch vertical, and 11.2 in the broad jump. So great explosive metrics there. He's kind of a home run hitter. He did have some pretty good production out of Tennessee. So somebody to keep an eye on. I think he's going to have a push here to, make his way into the third round of the NFL draft. If he does, that will be awesome. I'll be in on Jalen Wright. If he's fourth round or later, that's, a different story, but somebody you should keep an eye on. He had a 9.82 relative athletic score and a 114 speed score. So great metrics in both of those categories for Jalen Wright. Next up, is going to be Blake Corum. I have him as a winner coming into the combine. He measured in a little bit undersized compared to what it was listed at Michigan. Just under 5'8", 205 pounds. His 40 time was okay, nothing special, 4.53, but which led to a 1.58 in the 10-yard split. But the numbers that really stand out for Blake Corum are the 3-cone drill and the shuttle, which I think makes perfect sense if you've ever watched more than one game of Blake Corum, because that dude is shifty, he's elusive, he's got great vision, and these numbers show that. So we mentioned that the 3-cone drill is very important for running backs. He had a 6.82, which is right at that 75th percentile mark in the 3-cone drill. So that is something that we love to see from Blake Corum. He also had a 4.12 in the shuttle, which is above the 75th percentile mark for wide receiver ones over the past 15 or running back ones, over the past 15 years. So that's something also really great in terms of, agility and shiftiness that we like from Blake Corum. So I don't see Blake Corum as some home run hitting, breakaway speed type of running back in the NFL, but he's somebody that is going to get you some chunk plays and find the hole. And, with his size and his power, he's going to be a good goal line back as well. So he had 27 bench press reps, which was the most of running backs. And he had an 8.48 relative athletic score, which, given the somewhat slower 40-yard time, that's pretty good. So we'll take that. He had a 97 speed score. So Blake Corum, somebody that I still expect to probably get third-round draft capital. It's kind of the same story for a lot of these running backs. If they end up on day 2 in the second or third round, we'll be all in. And if they're fourth round or later, it's going to be a little bit more out. So we just got to cross our fingers and hope these guys get some good landing spots, ideally in the second or third round of the NFL draft. And next up is going to be Marshawn Lloyd, another guy who had a good combine out of USC, 5'9", 220 pounds. He ran a 4.46, and he ended up with that speed score of 111. So that takes into, his height and weight. So 8.9 relative athletic score. So again, kind of the theme with these 4 running backs that we've mentioned: good speed scores, great athletic scores, and most of them, 3 out of the 4 here, really good 40-yard dash times, and then Blake Corum, the one who didn't necessarily have the great 40 time, just elite agility numbers. So those 4 guys, Marshawn Lloyd has been a lot farther down my board up until this point. But he's somebody that I think is going to probably creep into the late second round of rookie drafts, where I think he's going somewhere in the third right now. So somebody to keep an eye on. It's going to, again, draft capital really, really matters with running backs. So Marshawn Lloyd, another name to keep an eye on. Now I've got 4 names that I'll kind of quickly rattle through in terms of late round sleepers at the running back position, guys that had really good combines. And the guy that probably had the single best combine at running back is Isaac Guerendo out of Louisville, 6 foot, 221 pounds, which are great numbers. And he ran a 4.33, really awesome 40-yard time, 1.55 in the 10-yard split, 41.5 vertical, 10.9 in the broad jump. So he met all those numbers across the board. Both of those explosive metrics were above the 75th percentile, and he ran a 6.94 three-cone time, which was within that 25th to 75th percentile range. It was somewhere between 25 and 50. 50th percentile mark was at 6.84, so a little bit below that, but still within that range that you want to see, and a 4.15 shuttle, which was better than the 75th percentile. So awesome to see from Isaac Guerendo, and he didn't get a ton of work at Louisville, so somebody that maybe will be more impactful as a pro than he was in college, but he had a 9.98 relative athletic score, so one of the best scores ever, and a 125.74 speed score, which is the number 1 in this class. So really awesome combine for him at Louisville. So somebody that you should keep an eye on. I'm not sure where he's going to go in the draft. I haven't seen him projected as a day 2 pick before. So, if he can find his way up after the combine, that would be great. But that's somebody that could be a sleeper for you in your draft. Another sleeper that had a good combine, Tyrone Tracy Jr. out of Purdue. He's 5'11", 209 pounds. He ran a 4.48. He had a 1.53 10-yard split. And just like Guerendo, he had some really good explosive numbers, 40 in the vertical, 10.4 in the broad jump. He had a 6.81 in the 3-cone, which is 0.01 better than Blake Corum. So awesome score in that 3-cone drill. That's above the 75th percentile mark. He had a 4.06 in the shuttle, which is also better than both Corum and Guerendo, and far above that 75th percentile mark. So really good agility numbers for him. He had a 9.75 relative athletic score and a 103 speed score. So Tyrone Tracy Jr., somebody to keep an eye on as a late sleeper in your rookie drafts. 2 more late sleepers. Dylan Laub from New Hampshire, 5'10", 206. Wasn't blazing fast or anything like that. He had a 4.54, but really good, explosive metrics and agility metrics. So he had we'll start with the 3-cone and the shuttle again because we mentioned how good Tyrone Tracy's numbers were. Dylan Laub was just as good. 6.84 in the 3-cone, which is only, 0.03 less than Tracy and 0.02 longer than Blake Corum, but a 4.02 in the shuttle, which is the fastest of anyone. That's a really great time. Far and away above the 75th percentile mark. He ended up with a 9.2 relative athletic score and a 96.98 speed score. So that's another guy, small school player that is likely going to be a day 3 pick if he's drafted. So, this is not somebody that's going to go in the 3rd round. But again, we're talking a 4th round rookie pick, somebody you can take a flyer on that has some nice metrics, could prove to be, a nice surprise late in drafts. And the last guy is Kamani Vidal from Troy, another smaller guy at 5'8", but he had 213 pounds. He ran a 4.46 in the 40-yard dash, had a 1.53 10-yard split, and good explosive numbers, was above the 50th percentile mark in both vertical and broad jump. He had a 7.01 in the 3-cone, which is between the 25th and 50th percentile marks for former number one running backs over the past 15 years. And he had a 4.14 shuttle time, which is above the 75th percentile mark there. So really nice numbers, 8.89 relative athletic score and a 107 speed score. So this is someone, Vidal is not going to be a day 2 pick. This is another, sometime on day 3 you take your flyer in the late 3rd or sometime in the 4th round of your rookie drafts and hope that you can hit on a diamond in the rough. So there you have it from the running back position in terms of winners. In terms of losers, there are 3. 2 big names that we mentioned. I'm going to start with the biggest loser of all players at the Combine from a fantasy perspective, and that's Bucky Irving out of Oregon. 5'9", 192 pounds, which was a very, very small from a weight perspective. And it's unfortunate because he's a great receiving back, but for somebody that's going to be that small, they need to be fast, and he's not. He ran a 4.55 in the 40-yard dash, which, again, for somebody that's 192 pounds, you're looking for somebody that's running in the 4.3s, and he just didn't. And that's reflected in his relative athletic score. He had a 3.71, which is below the bare minimum threshold at running back. So, unfortunately, his chances of being a day 2 pick probably completely out the window. And at this point, you're talking about a, sometime on day 3, 5th round type of pick. And you just hope that he can get some sort of receiving role. But it's really unfortunate. He had a, poor vertical number, 29.5, which is just barely above the minimum threshold. Solid 10-yard split. But other than that, just really underwhelming across the board. And as I mentioned, he's one of those 2 bigger name players that did not reach that minimum threshold of a speed score of 90. He checked in just below that at 89.6. So Bucky Irving is going to be significantly lower in my rankings after this Combine. Another guy who's going to fall, which is unfortunate again, because just like Bucky Irving, I did like this player a lot. And that's Audric Estime out of Notre Dame, 5'11", 221 pounds. He was just really slow. 4.71 in the 40-yard dash, which is below the bare minimum threshold of a 4.7. So that just really stinks because we all knew that he was not going to be, a speedster, but I think the tape shows a little bit more explosiveness than his 40 time does. So that's, tough to see. But on the bright side, the explosiveness does come through with the vertical and the broad jump. So it's sort of a weird Combine for Estime because while his 40-yard time was bad, his vertical was great at 38. His broad jump was at 10.5. So, a 10.5 in the broad jump, a 38 in the vertical, those are good explosive metrics. And he's going to be like a first or second down, like power back. This is not going to be a 3 down, pass catching, just do it all running back. So there will be a place for Estime in the NFL. But I kind of think of him as, maybe more of like a Gus Edwards type based on this. So he's going to fall down my draft board as well. I don't see him going in the 3rd round of the NFL draft, which means he's probably going to be a 3rd round pick in your rookie drafts. So those 2, the biggest losers, but another guy that I think has a bigger name, somebody that people recognize from college that was, not really getting a ton of hype for fantasy, but the Combine really stunk for him, and that's Dylan Johnson, the running back out of Washington. 6 foot, 217 pounds, was a great college player, but just really underwhelming numbers across the board at the Combine for him. He ran a 4.68 in the 40-yard dash, 1.62 10-yard split, which is, just barely above that minimum threshold of a 1.65. Mediocre explosive numbers with 31.5 in the vertical and 9.9 in the broad jump. And his relative athletic score was a 4.34. So just nothing there. He does barely meet the speed score metric. He had a 90.47, so just above that 90.0 that you're looking for, but I just don't see a path for Dillon Johnson, which is unfortunate. And then Amani Bailey, another guy who poor combine for him. I just want to touch on his relative athletic score because he was one of only 3 players that were completely below the bare minimum threshold. He only had a 3.58 for the relative athletic score, so another guy that you can just rule out as a late round sleeper. Now, I know we're taking a long time here on this podcast, so I'll kind of quickly go through the tight ends and the wide receivers, but I did want to spend significantly more time on the running backs and receivers because I do think that's more important coming out of the combine. So, again, your winners at the running back position: Trey Benson, Jalen Wright, Blake Corum, Marshawn Lloyd, Isaac Guerrero, Tyrone Tracy Jr., Dylan Laub, and Kamani Vidal. And then your losers: Bucky Irving, Audric Estime, and Dillon Johnson. At tight end, we only have 2 players here that I really want to touch on, and that's Theo Johnson and Ben Sinnott. And they were both awesome. The NFL Combine really matters at the tight end position. Athletic ability is very important. So this RAS score and the 40-yard time are things that do matter at the tight end position. So while Brock Bowers, the obvious number 1 tight end, did not do anything at the Combine, you did weigh in at 243, which was good to see. Would have been nicer if we saw him run the 40-yard dash at that weight. But Theo Johnson had a 9.99 relative athletic score out of Penn State. 6'6", 259 pounds, and he ran a 4.57. And so we talk about athletic traits. I think this is someone that could get pushed up draft boards a bit. Probably going to be somewhere in the middle rounds, 3rd or 4th round pick. It's hard to say. But if he gets that day 2 draft capital, Theo Johnson will be somebody that I think a lot of people take interest in, and will be a nice 3rd round rookie pick in your drafts. Not mock drafts. I always want to say that, but your real drafts, he will be a 3rd round pick if he gets 3rd round draft capital. Ben Sinnott, the other guy I wanted to touch on from Kansas State, 6'4", 250 pounds, ran a 4.68 in the 40-yard dash. He had a 9.75 relative athletic score. So those are really the 2 players, Johnson and Sinnott, that kind of, I think, have moved up and are probably going to be tight end 3 and 4 for a lot of people coming out of the NFL draft. Now, it will depend on where Cade Stover goes. He had a solid showing as well, so that's another name to keep an eye on. He'll be in that mix. Jatavian Sanders had an okay combine. Nothing special, but nothing bad. Thankfully, his second 40-yard dash time did come in at 4.69, which was good. 4.7 is kind of the magic number that you want to look at that position. So that's really all there is to the tight ends. It'll just depend on some draft capital, but in terms of pure athleticism, Theo Johnson and Ben Sinnott are 2 guys that you should be keeping an eye on. And last but not least, the most important position in the NFL, quarterback. And unfortunately, we did not get a lot of action with the top quarterbacks because Caleb Williams did not participate, Drake May did not participate, and Jaden Daniels didn't do anything at all. They didn't even do measurements, let alone participate. So the only guys that really did a lot were J.J. McCarthy, Michael Penix, and then Spencer Rattler, if we just limit it to guys that are probably going to be day 1 or day 2 picks. So the 2 winners in my mind, J.J. McCarthy and Michael Penix Jr., both had nice combines. While Michael Penix didn't do any testing, Michael Penix was great from a drill perspective. Really did a good job, hitting his receivers and just doing everything that he could to show why he is such an elite vertical passer. So Michael Penix pretty much solidified himself in the pre-draft process as my QB5 behind J.J. McCarthy, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, and Caleb Williams. But, it will depend on draft capital, but I do think that there's a good shot he ends up going in the early 2nd, potentially late 1st if somebody decides to trade in for that 5th-year option. But I like where Michael Penix stands. I think the really critical thing that came out was all reports were that his medicals were good, and with somebody with the kind of extensive injury history that he has, that was going to be something really important for him. So good health, good combine. We love to see it for Michael Penix Jr. And then J.J. McCarthy, who out of Michigan checked in at 6'2.5". Just under that 6'3" that he was listed at. But the big number for him was he weighed in at 219 pounds, which was up from the 202 that he was listed at Michigan. So really good number. He did not run the 40-yard dash because he had some hamstring tightness, but he did run the 3-cone drill, which I want to touch on. He had a 6.82 in the 3-cone, which was the 6th best overall out of all players at the combine, regardless of position. So I do think that shows the kind of athlete J.J. McCarthy is. So while he doesn't have, those gaudy rushing totals that Drake May or Jaden Daniels have, he has a lot of athleticism. He can move around the pocket and escape. So I think a very good combine for him, and something that we heard a lot of buzz that he might go even higher than we've talked about. We've talked a lot, top 12, something like that, but he might be a top 5 pick. There's been a lot of chatter that there could be some trades, the 4th and 5th picks, and who knows? The NFL draft is always a wild event, so we'll see how free agency shapes that. We're going to talk a lot about free agency next week and get into free agency landing spots and where we'd like to see players land, and discuss the fantasy impact of free agency coming up here in mid-March. But J.J. McCarthy, big benefit at the NFL Combine. So really just McCarthy and Penix at the QB position that I wanted to touch on. Spencer Rattler did the drills. I think there's been some talk about him, being his 2nd, 3rd round pick. I'm not sure if I see it with him yet, but some underwhelming numbers, a 4.95 in the 40-yard dash. For comparison to J.J. McCarthy's 3-cone drill, McCarthy was at a 6.82 and Rattler was at a 7.21. So just to give you some context there, because I think Rattler is known to be a relatively shifty guy in his own right. So just some context. So, there you have it. That's all there is to discuss here. Longer episode than normal, which I apologize for, but there are a lot of names and numbers to go through coming out of the NFL Combine. And now it's time to dive into film and see, how these numbers match up with what we see on the field. And we'll, shape our rookie rankings and try to get them as finalized as possible pre-draft. And we'll do a couple episodes in early April where we really do a deep dive into each position. We'll do a full in-depth rankings at every single position and talk about who we like and don't like, both early round and late round picks. So stay tuned for that. But for now, thank you so much for tuning in. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you. And we hope you learned something that you can apply in your leagues. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks so much.